The cemetery keeper's shovel struck something that shouldn't have been there. Josiah Blackwood had been tending Willowbrook Cemetery for 37 years, and in all that time, he'd never heard chains rattling beneath the earth during the evening rounds. The sun hung low over the ancient headstones, casting long shadows between the weathered monuments when the sound first reached his ears, a metallic scraping that made his blood run cold. He'd been walking the familiar path between the older graves, checking for vandalism, and ensuring the flower arrangements hadn't been disturbed by the autumn wind, when the noise stopped him dead in his tracks. It was coming from beneath the Whitmore family plot, a section of the cemetery that dated back to the 1800s. The massive granite headstone bore the name Constance Adelaide Whitmore, 1847-1863, beloved daughter, and it was from directly beneath this marker that the sound emerged. Josiah set down his lantern and pressed his ear to the ground. The rattling continued, rhythmic and desperate, like someone trying to break free from metal bonds. His weathered hands trembled as he reached for the shovel. In nearly 4 decades of cemetery work, he'd encountered many strange things: midnight, visitors, unexplained lights, even the occasional grave robber. But nothing had prepared him for the possibility that someone might be trapped beneath the earth, alive and fighting for freedom. The first shovelful of dirt revealed nothing unusual. The second brought up a handful of old fabric, rotted and stained with age. By the third, Josiah realized he was digging through what should have been an undisturbed grave, and his conscience began to war with his curiosity. Desecrating a grave was not only illegal, but went against every principle he'd held sacred during his long career. Yet the sounds continued, growing more frantic as darkness fell. As his shovel bit deeper into the earth, Josiah's lantern cast dancing shadows across the disturbed soil. The Whitmore plot had always been one of the cemetery's most prestigious locations, positioned on a slight hill that overlooked the entire grounds. Old Cornelius Whitmore had been one of the town's founding fathers, and his family had maintained the plot for generations. But in recent years, no one came to visit. The last of the Whitmore line had died out decades ago, leaving only this forgotten corner of the cemetery to mark their existence. The chain rattling grew louder as Josiah's shovel struck something solid. He scraped away the dirt carefully, revealing what appeared to be a wooden surface, but not the rotted remnants of a century-old coffin. This wood was newer, sturdy, and bore the scratches and gouges of something sharp being dragged across its surface from within. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone was trapped in a makeshift coffin, buried alive beneath a headstone that marked a grave from 1863. Josiah's hands shook as he cleared more dirt away from the wooden surface. The chains were definitely coming from inside, along with what sounded like muffled cries. His mind raced through the possibilities. This couldn't be some elaborate prank. The effort required to dig a grave this deep and bury someone alive would take hours, and the risk of discovery was enormous. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that whoever was trapped beneath the earth would never be found. The wooden surface was revealed to be a rough-hewn box, hastily constructed but solid enough to bear the weight of several feet of earth. Iron chains had been wrapped around the entire structure and secured with a heavy padlock that looked distinctly modern. Whoever had done this had wanted to ensure that even if their victims somehow managed to break free from whatever bonds held them inside the box, they would still be trapped by the chains that encircled their prison. As Josiah worked to clear the dirt from around the box, he noticed other disturbing details. The earth around the grave had been disturbed recently. Within the last day or 2, he estimated, fresh tool marks were visible in the soil, and the grass that had been removed to access the grave site had been carefully replaced, but hadn't had time to take root again. This was no random act of violence. Someone had planned this carefully, choosing a grave that was unlikely to be visited and ensuring that their victim would be discovered only by accident, if at all. The chains rattling from within the box had taken on a new urgency, as if whoever was trapped inside could sense that rescue was near. Josiah called out, his voice barely above a whisper, "Hold on, I'm getting you out of there." The response was immediate, a series of frantic banging sounds that confirmed his worst fears. Someone was indeed buried alive, and from the strength of their struggles, they hadn't been there long. Josiah's mind raced as he considered his options. He could run to town and fetch the sheriff, but that would take at least an hour, and whoever was trapped might not have that long. The box was already several feet below ground level, and the air supply inside would be limited. Every minute counted. He could try to break the chains himself, but the padlock was heavy-duty and would require tools he didn't have with him. His only option was to continue digging, to fully expose the box and find a way to open it. As he worked, Josiah found himself wondering who could have done such a thing. Willowbrook was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The kind of planning and physical effort required to bury someone alive in the cemetery would be hard to hide. Whoever was responsible either lived outside the community or was someone trusted enough that their presence in the cemetery wouldn't raise suspicions. The thought that someone he knew might be capable of such cruelty made his stomach churn. The box was finally fully exposed, and Josiah could see that it had been constructed with air holes drilled into the sides, small openings that would provide just enough oxygen to keep someone alive for a short time, but not enough for long-term survival. The chains were wrapped around the box in a complex pattern that spoke of military or nautical experience. Someone with knowledge of knots and restraints had ensured that even if the padlock failed, the chains would hold the box closed. Inside the box, the sounds had changed from frantic rattling to what sounded like sobbing. Josiah's heart broke as he realized that whoever was trapped inside had probably given up hope of rescue. The psychological torture of being buried alive was almost worse than the physical reality of suffocation. He began examining the chains more closely, looking for a weak point or a way to slip them off the box without breaking the padlock. That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the wooden surface of the box, barely visible in the lantern light, were words carved from the inside. "Find the truth beneath the Whitmore grave." The message was carved in desperate, uneven letters, as if someone had used their fingernails or a small piece of metal to scratch the words into the wood. But it was the implication of the message that truly terrified Josiah. This wasn't just a random act of violence. Someone had been buried alive as a message, and that message was intended for whoever found them. Josiah looked around the cemetery, suddenly aware of how isolated he was. The nearest house was half a mile away, and the road that led to the cemetery was rarely traveled after dark. If whoever had done this was still in the area, he would be completely defenseless. But the sounds from within the box reminded him that someone's life hung in the balance. He couldn't abandon them, regardless of the danger to himself. He began to work more systematically, looking for a way to open the box without destroying it. The construction was crude but effective. Whoever had built it had been more concerned with function than appearance. The wood was held together with long screws rather than nails, which meant that with the right tools, it could be disassembled. But all Josiah had was his shovel and a small knife he used for cutting flowers. As he worked, trying to find a way to loosen one of the screws with his knife blade, Josiah found himself thinking about the Whitmore family. Constance Adelaide had been just 16 when she died, according to the headstone. The story passed down through local folklore was that she had died of consumption, like so many young people in that era. But there had always been whispers of something darker, rumors that the family had tried to suppress. Some said she had been murdered by a rejected suitor. Others claimed she had taken her own life rather than submit to an arranged marriage. The truth had been buried with the family's secrets, and now someone was using her grave to hide their own dark deeds. The irony wasn't lost on Josiah. If the message carved into the box was to be believed, someone wanted the truth about Constance Whitmore's death to be discovered, but they had chosen to deliver that message by burying someone alive in her grave. The cruelty of the method suggested that whoever was responsible had a personal connection to the Whitmore family or to the secrets that had been buried with them. The sun disappeared completely behind the horizon. Josiah's lantern became the only source of light in the cemetery. The shadows it cast seemed to dance and writhe among the headstones, creating an atmosphere of menace that made every sound seem amplified. The chains continued to rattle weakly from within the box, but the sounds were growing fainter. Time was running out. Josiah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to try to open the box with his inadequate tools, he would break the padlock with his shovel. It was a risk, The impact might damage the box or harm whoever was inside, but it was the only option left. He positioned his shovel carefully and brought it down with all his strength on the padlock. The first blow produced a shower of sparks but didn't break the lock. The second cracked the metal. The third sent the padlock flying into the darkness, and the chains fell away from the box with a sound like liberation itself. Josiah's hands shook as he lifted the lid of the makeshift coffin, not knowing what he would find inside. The woman who looked up at him from the confines of the box was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair and eyes that held a mixture of terror and relief. Her wrists and ankles were bound with rope, and a gag had been secured around her mouth, but she was alive, breathing, and conscious. As Josiah cut through her bonds with his knife, she gasped and tried to speak, but no words came at first, only the desperate sounds of someone who had believed they were going to die. "It's all right," Josiah said softly, helping her sit up in the box. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. Cordelia Thorne." She paused, gathering strength. They said if I didn't tell them where it was hidden, they would bury me alive until I changed my mind." Josiah helped her climb out of the box, noting that despite her ordeal, she seemed to be physically unharmed apart from the rope burns on her wrists and ankles. What was hidden?" he asked gently. Cordelia looked around the cemetery, her eyes focusing on the headstone that marked Constance Whitmore's grave. "The documents," she said. "The papers that prove what really happened to Constance Whitmore. They're hidden somewhere in this cemetery, and someone wants them badly enough to kill for them." As Josiah helped Cordelia to her feet, he realized that saving her from the makeshift grave was only the beginning. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to extract information from her, and they had chosen the Whitmore grave specifically because of its connection to whatever secret she possessed. The message carved into the box, "Find the truth beneath the Whitmore grave," wasn't just a cry for help. It was a clue, a direction towards something that had been hidden for over a century and a half. The cemetery that Josiah had tended for nearly 4 decades suddenly felt foreign and threatening, and every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound could signal danger. But as he looked at Cordelia, still shaking from her ordeal but determined to see this through, he knew that they had no choice but to discover what lay beneath the Whitmore grave. Someone had buried her alive to get information about it, which meant they would certainly kill to keep it hidden. "We need to get you to safety," Josiah said, but Cordelia shook her head. "No," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "We need to find what they were looking for, because if we don't, they'll just come back for me, and next time they might not bother with trying to keep me alive." Dr. Cordelia Thorne had been researching the Whitmore family for 18 months when she stumbled upon the document that changed everything. As a historical researcher specializing in 19th century genealogy, she was accustomed to uncovering family secrets buried in courthouse records and church registries. But what she found in the basement archives of the county courthouse went far beyond the typical scandals of adultery or financial impropriety that usually marked her discoveries. The document was a coroner's report, dated October 15, 1863, and signed by one Dr. Ezekiel Morrison. It detailed the circumstances surrounding the death of Constance Adelaide Whitmore, and it contradicted everything that local history had recorded about the young woman's demise. According to the official story that had been passed down through generations, Constance had died of consumption after a long illness. The coroner's report told a very different story. Subject shows evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. Dr. Morrison had written in his careful script, multiple contusions consistent with repeated blows from a heavy object. No evidence of disease present. Cause of death, murder by person or persons unknown. But what made the document truly explosive was what followed. A separate page, written in the same hand but clearly added later, contained a statement that made Cordelia's blood run cold. Investigation terminated by order of Judge Cornelius Whitmore. Evidence sealed pending further inquiry. No further inquiry authorized. Cornelius Whitmore was Constance's own father, and he had used his position as a circuit judge to cover up his daughter's murder. But the document raised more questions than it answered. Who had killed Constance? Why had her father covered it up? And most importantly, what evidence had been sealed away that might still exist somewhere in the town's historical records? Cordelia's research had led her to other disturbing discoveries. Constance Whitmore had not been the only young woman to die under mysterious circumstances in Willowbrook during the 1860s. 3 other girls had perished within a 2-year period, all between the ages of 15 and 18, all officially attributed to various illnesses. But court records showed that each death had occurred shortly after the girl in question had been seen in the company of prominent town leaders, including Cornelius Whitmore himself. The pattern suggested something far more sinister than individual crimes of passion. It pointed to a systematic predation upon young women, protected by the very men who were supposed to uphold justice in the community. Cordelia had found references to a Willowbrook Society in several documents, described as a men's social club that met regularly to discuss business and politics, but the dates of their meetings corresponded closely with the dates of the mysterious deaths, and the membership included every man who had held a position of authority in the town during that period. As Cordelia shared her discoveries with Josiah in the shadowy cemetery, she could see the horror dawning in his eyes. The peaceful community that he had served for nearly 4 decades had been built on a foundation of murder and conspiracy. The respected founding fathers whose monuments dotted the cemetery had been killers, and their crimes had been covered up by a judicial system they controlled. The Willowbrook Society, Cordelia continued, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to share what she had learned. It wasn't just a social club. Based on the documents I found, it was a group of wealthy men who believed they had the right to take whatever they wanted from anyone weaker than themselves. Young women from poor families were their preferred victims, because no one would believe accusations against such respected citizens. Josiah's face hardened as he listened. And Constance Whitmore, how does she fit into this? That's where it gets complicated, Cordelia replied. Constance wasn't from a poor family. She was Cornelius Whitmore's daughter, which should have protected her, but I found evidence that she discovered what her father and his associates were doing. She tried to expose them, and they killed her for it. The implications were staggering. Cornelius Whitmore had not only participated in the murder of innocent young women, but had ultimately killed his own daughter to protect the conspiracy. Then he had used his judicial authority to cover up the crime and ensure that no investigation would ever be conducted. The corruption had been absolute, extending from the highest levels of local government down to the men who enforced the law. But how do you know all this? Josiah asked. These are serious accusations against men who have been dead for over a century. Cordelia reached into her jacket and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Because Constance kept a diary, and someone made sure it survived. This was hidden in the courthouse archives, along with the coroner's report, and other evidence that Cornelius thought he had destroyed. Someone, probably Dr. Morrison himself, preserved it all. She opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. Listen to this entry, dated October 10th, 1863, just 5 days before she died. I can no longer remain silent about the evil that has taken root in our town. Father and his associates have committed crimes that cry out to heaven for vengeance. They believe their wealth and position place them above God's law, but I will not be party to their sins. I have written down everything I know, and I have hidden the evidence where it will be safe until someone with the courage to act upon it comes forward. Josiah felt a chill run down his spine. She hid evidence. Where? That's what I've been trying to figure out, Cordelia replied. The diary contains several references to a sacred trust and mentions that she placed the evidence where the dead keep their secrets. I believe she hid it somewhere in this cemetery, probably in or near her own grave. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they painted a picture that was almost too horrible to accept. Constance Whitmore had discovered that her father was part of a murderous conspiracy, had gathered evidence to expose it, and had hidden that evidence. Before her own murder, for over 150 years, the truth had been buried with her, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. But why would someone bury you alive to get this information? Josiah asked. These crimes happened more than a century ago. Everyone involved is long dead. Cordelia's expression darkened. Because the Willowbrook Society didn't die with its original members, I found evidence that it continued to operate, passing down its traditions from father to son, from mentor to protege. The names changed, but the practices remained the same. They've been covering up murders and other crimes in this town for generations. The revelation hit Josiah like a physical blow. If Cordelia was right, then the corruption that had claimed Constance Whitmore's life had never ended. It had simply adapted to changing times, finding new ways to hide its activities and new victims to exploit. The respected citizens of modern Willowbrook might be the inheritors of a tradition of violence and conspiracy that stretched back to the town's founding. "Who buried you alive?" Josiah asked quietly. "I never saw their faces clearly," Cordelia replied. "They grabbed me from behind when I was leaving the courthouse yesterday evening, but I heard them talking while they were building the box. They knew exactly what I had found, and they knew I was getting close to finding Constance's hidden evidence. Someone has been watching my research probably for months." The thought that Cordelia had been under surveillance for an extended period made Josiah acutely aware of how exposed they were in the cemetery. If her attackers were still in the area, they would certainly return to check on their handiwork. Finding the grave empty and their prisoner escaped would send them into a panic that could make them even more dangerous. "We need to find this evidence," Josiah said. "If it's as damaging as you believe, it might be the only thing that keeps you alive, but we can't do it alone. We need help from someone we can trust." Cordelia shook her head firmly. "No, I tried going to the authorities when I first discovered the coroner's report. Sheriff Henderson told me that I was stirring up trouble over ancient history, and that I should focus my research on more positive aspects of the town's heritage. 2 days later, someone broke into my hotel room and went through all my papers. The corruption isn't just historical, Josiah. It's active and present. The realization that they were completely on their own was both terrifying and liberating. They couldn't trust anyone in official positions, which meant they would have to solve this mystery themselves. But it also meant they could act without worrying about political consequences or bureaucratic obstacles. They could follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of whose reputation it might damage. "Tell me about the diary," Josiah said. "Are there any specific clues about where Constance might have hidden the evidence?" Cordelia flipped through the pages, pointing to various entries. She mentions several locations in the cemetery. There's a reference to the guardian who watches over the innocent, which might refer to a statue or monument. She also writes about the place where water meets stone, which could be the old well that used to be located near the back of the cemetery. And there's this cryptic reference to the 13th step, but I haven't been able to figure out what that means. Josiah nodded thoughtfully. He knew the cemetery better than anyone alive, and several of Cordelia's references were starting to make sense. The guardian who watches over the innocent was almost certainly the angel statue that stood at the center of the children's section. The old well had been filled in decades ago, but its stone cover was still visible if you knew where to look. As for the 13th step, that was more puzzling. There were no staircases in the cemetery that he could think of. "There's something else," Cordelia continued. "The diary mentions that Constance wasn't working alone. She had an ally, someone she refers to only as the doctor. Based on the context, I believe it was Dr. Morrison, the coroner who wrote the original report. She trusted him enough to share her evidence with him, and he may have helped her hide it. The idea that Dr. Morrison had been complicit in preserving evidence against the Willowbrook Society made perfect sense. As the town's coroner, he would have been in a position to see the truth about the mysterious deaths. His decision to preserve the evidence, even after being ordered to terminate his investigation, showed remarkable courage for someone who must have known the danger he was placing himself in. Morrison died in 1889, Josiah said. I remember seeing his grave marker in the older section of the cemetery. If he was helping Constance, he might have left his own clues about where the evidence is hidden. Cordelia's eyes lit up with excitement. That's brilliant. If we can find his grave, there might be something there that will help us locate what Constance hid. The diary mentions that she gave him a copy of everything she had collected, as insurance against something happening to her own cash. As they prepared to search the cemetery for clues, Josiah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows between the headstones seemed deeper and more threatening than usual, and every sound made him jump. But Cordelia's determination was infectious, and he found himself committed to seeing this through regardless of the personal cost. "Before we start looking," Cordelia said, "there's something else you need to know. The Willowbrook Society didn't just kill those girls for pleasure. They were involved in something bigger, something that involved people from outside the town. The diary mentions visits from men who came from the state capital, and payments that were made for services rendered. I think the local conspiracy was part of a larger network. The scope of what they were dealing with was becoming clear, and it was far more extensive than either of them had initially imagined. They weren't just investigating a century-old murder. They were uncovering a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for generations, protected by wealth, political influence, and a willingness to kill anyone who threatened to expose them. "Cordelia," Josiah said quietly, "even if we find this evidence, what makes you think we can do anything with it? If this conspiracy is as powerful as you believe, they'll find a way to suppress whatever we discover." She looked at him with fierce determination. "Because Constance Whitmore died trying to expose them, and her death will mean nothing if we don't finish what she started. Besides, times have changed. We have ways of sharing information that they can't control completely. If we can find solid evidence of what they've been doing, we can make it public in ways that will be impossible to suppress." As they prepared to begin their search, Josiah realized that his quiet life as a cemetery keeper was over forever. Whether they succeeded or failed in their quest to uncover the truth, he would never again be able to tend the graves without thinking about the secrets buried beneath them. The peaceful sanctuary he had guarded for nearly 4 decades had been revealed as a repository of dark history, and he was now committed to bringing that history into the light. The first place they decided to search was Dr. Morrison's grave, located in a section of the cemetery that dated back to the 1880s. As they made their way through the darkness, guided only by Josiah's lantern and his intimate knowledge of the cemetery's layout, both of them were acutely aware that they might not be alone. The people who had buried Cordelia alive would certainly return to check on their work, and finding her gone would trigger a desperate search. But there was no turning back now. They had committed themselves to uncovering the truth about Constance Whitmore's death and exposing the conspiracy that had claimed her life. The evidence was somewhere in the cemetery, waiting to be discovered after more than a century of concealment. All they had to do was find it before their enemies found them. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison's grave was located in the oldest section of Willowbrook Cemetery, beneath a towering oak tree that had probably been planted around the time of his death. The headstone was simple granite, bearing only his name, the dates, 1823-1889, and the inscription, "Healer of Bodies, Seeker of Truth." But as Josiah and Cordelia examined the monument more closely by lantern light, they discovered that the good doctor had left more than just a noble epitaph, carved into the base of the headstone, so subtly that it was almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Was a series of numbers, 39, 7, 13, 25. At first glance, they appeared to be random scratches left by decades of weather and wear. But when Cordelia traced them with her finger, it became clear that they had been deliberately carved into the stone, probably by Morrison himself before his death. "It's a code," Cordelia whispered, her excitement barely contained. "Morrison left us a message." Josiah studied the numbers carefully. "But what do they mean?" "They could refer to anything. Dates, locations, page numbers in a book. Remember what Constance wrote in her diary about the 13th step?" Cordelia replied. "One of these numbers is 13. And look at this." She also mentioned giving the doctor a complete copy of her evidence. What if these numbers are coordinates or a map reference? They spent several minutes examining the rest of Morrison's gravesite, looking for additional clues. The area around the headstone had been carefully maintained over the years, but there were no obvious hiding places where documents could have been concealed for over a century. However, Josiah noticed something unusual about the oak tree that shaded the grave. "This tree is older than Morrison's death date," he observed. "It was probably here when he was still alive. And look at this," He pointed to a section of the trunk where the bark had grown over what appeared to be a metal object embedded in the wood. Someone drove something into this tree a long time ago. Cordelia moved closer to examine the tree. The metal object was barely visible, covered by decades of bark growth, but its outline suggested it might be a small box or container. If Morrison wanted to hide something where it would be safe from discovery, but accessible to someone who knew where to look, this would be perfect. The tree would protect it from the elements and the growing bark would conceal it from casual observation. Working carefully with Josiah's knife, they began to peel away the outer layers of bark that had grown over the mysterious object. The work was slow and delicate. They didn't want to damage whatever Morrison had hidden, and they needed to avoid making too much noise that might attract unwanted attention. As they worked, Cordelia continued to study the numbers carved into the headstone, trying to decipher their meaning. What if they're not coordinates, she mused. What if they refer to specific graves in the cemetery? Morrison would have been familiar with the burial records, and he could have used grave numbers as a reference system. Josiah paused in his work on the tree. The cemetery has been expanded several times since Morrison's era. The numbering system might have changed, but there are records in the maintenance shed that go back to the founding of the cemetery. If Morrison used grave numbers as a code, we might be able to figure out what he was referring to. After 20 minutes of careful work, they managed to expose the object embedded in the tree trunk. It was indeed a small metal box, about the size of a jewelry case, and it appeared to be made of tin or some other material that had resisted corrosion. The box was secured with a simple latch that had been protected by the tree's growth over the decades. Cordelia's hands trembled as she opened the latch. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them remarkably well, were several folded documents. The paper was yellowed with age but still legible, and the handwriting was unmistakably the same as that found on Morrison's coroner's report. The first document was a letter addressed to whomever may find this record. Morrison's message was clear and direct. I, Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby attest that the information contained herein is true and accurate to the best of my knowledge. The crimes described were witnessed by myself, or reported to me by credible witnesses. I have preserved this evidence in the hope that someday justice will be served upon those who have escaped earthly punishment for their heinous acts. What followed was a detailed account of the Willowbrook Society's activities, written in Morrison's precise medical terminology, but leaving no doubt about the nature of the crimes committed. The doctor had documented not just the murders of young women, but also a systematic pattern of corruption, extortion, and abuse that had characterized the town's leadership for decades. Names, dates, and specific incidents were all carefully recorded, creating a comprehensive picture of criminal conspiracy that reached into every aspect of the community's power structure. My God, Cordelia breathed as she read through Morrison's account. He documented everything. Look at this. He even recorded conversations he overheard between society members. They didn't just kill those girls. They were trafficking young women from other towns, selling them to wealthy men in distant cities. The murders only happened when the girls tried to escape or threatened to expose the operation. Josiah felt sick as he absorbed the implications of Morrison's evidence. The Willowbrook Society hadn't been just a group of local predators. They had been part of an organized criminal network that operated across state lines, protected by corrupt officials at every level of government. The scope of the conspiracy was almost impossible to comprehend, but it was the final document in Morrison's cache that truly stunned them both. Written in the doctor's hand but signed by Constance Whitmore herself, it was a sworn statement detailing her father's involvement in the society's activities. She had witnessed meetings in the family home, had overheard conversations about the fate of missing girls, and had even seen evidence of the payments made to society members for their participation in the trafficking operation. I can no longer remain silent about my father's crimes, Constance had written. He has betrayed every principle of justice and decency, and his actions have brought shame upon our family name. I have gathered evidence of his guilt, and I have hidden it where It will be safe until someone with the courage to act upon it comes forward. I pray that God will forgive me for waiting so long to speak the truth. The statement was dated October 12, 1863, just 3 days before Constance's murder. She had known the danger she was in when she wrote it, but she had been determined to ensure that the evidence would survive even if she did not. Her courage in the face of almost certain death was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The numbers on Morrison's headstone, Cordelia said suddenly. They must refer to where Constance hid her evidence. He would have been the only person she trusted with that information. They returned to studying the carved numbers, 39-7 to 1325. Now that they had Morrison's account to work with, the code seemed less mysterious. Josiah had an idea about the cemetery's record-keeping system that might help them decode the message. In the old burial records, he explained, graves were often numbered by section, row, and position. If Morrison was using that system, these numbers might refer to specific burial sites where Constance hid her evidence. They made their way to the cemetery's maintenance shed, where Josiah kept copies of all the historical records. The original burial registers were stored in a metal filing cabinet that had been installed in the 1920s, but the information dated back to the cemetery's founding. By the light of his lantern, Josiah began searching through the records for graves that corresponded to Morrison's numbers. The first number, 39, corresponded to Section 39, which was located in the oldest part of the cemetery near the Whitmore family plot. The second number, 7, indicated row 7 within that section. The third number, 13, was the position within the row, the 13th grave from the beginning. The final number, 25, was more puzzling until Josiah realized it might refer to the depth in inches where something was buried. If I'm right about this code, Josiah said, Constance hid something at the 13th grave in row 7 of section UUI 39, buried 25 inches deep. That would put it well below the level of a normal grave, in a spot where it wouldn't be disturbed by routine cemetery maintenance. They gathered the tools they would need for another excavation and made their way back into the cemetery. Section 39 was only a few hundred yards from Morrison's grave, but it felt like miles as they moved carefully through the darkness, constantly alert for any sign that they were being watched. The 13th grave in row 7 bore the name Minerva Ashford, 1841-1860, taken too soon. Josiah recognized the name from Morrison's documents. Minerva had been one of the first victims of the Willowbrook Society, officially recorded as having died of scarlet fever, but actually murdered when she tried to escape from the men who had purchased her. The irony of Constance choosing this particular grave as a hiding place was not lost on either of them. She had honored one of the society's victims by making her final resting place the repository for evidence that might finally bring their killers to justice. Cordelia knelt beside the headstone, while Josiah began to dig carefully at the specified location. 25 inches was deeper than either of them had expected, and the work was exhausting in the humid night air. But as the shovel bit into the earth, both of them were driven by the knowledge that they were finally close to uncovering the truth that had been hidden for over a century. The first indication that they had found something came when Josiah's shovel struck what sounded like metal. Scraping away the soil more carefully, he revealed the corner of what appeared to be a lead-lined box, similar to those used by photographers of the era to protect sensitive materials from moisture and decay. The box was small, no more than a foot square, but it had been wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth and sealed with wax to ensure its contents would survive. "This is it," Cordelia whispered, her voice filled with awe. "After all these years, we're actually going to see what Constance died trying to protect." Josiah lifted the box carefully from its hiding place and carried it to a nearby bench where they could examine it properly. The lead lining had done its job well, despite being buried for over 150 years. The box showed no signs of corrosion or water damage. The wax seal was still intact, suggesting that no one had discovered Constance's cache since she had hidden it. Breaking the seal felt almost sacrilegious, like disturbing the tomb of a pharaoh or opening a sacred relic. But as Cordelia carefully pried open the lid, both of them knew they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of their community's history forever. The contents of the box exceeded even their highest expectations. Constance had been remarkably thorough in documenting the Willowbrook Society's crimes. There were photographs, daguerreotypes that showed society members with their victims, images that were clearly intended as blackmail material or trophies. There were letters written by society members, discussing their activities with the casual tone of men arranging a business transaction. There were financial records showing payments made to corrupt officials, judges, and law enforcement officers who had helped cover up the society's crimes. But most damning of all were the membership rolls, complete with initials, dates of induction, and records of each member's contributions to the society's activities. The list read, like a who's who of 19th century Willowbrook society: judges, merchants, clergy, doctors, and politicians. Even the sheriff who had supposedly investigated the mysterious deaths was listed as a founding member of the organization. "Look at this," Cordelia said, pointing to a document that appeared to be meeting minutes from 1862. They weren't just operating locally. There are references to similar societies in other towns, all connected through a network that they called the Brotherhood of Silent Commerce. They were sharing victims, trading girls like commodities, and protecting each other from prosecution. Josiah studied a photograph that showed several men in formal attire, standing around what was clearly a bound and terrified young woman. The men's faces were clearly visible, and he recognized several of them from portraits that hung in the town hall and the courthouse. These were the founding fathers of Willowbrook, the men whose names adorned streets and public buildings, whose descendants still held positions of prominence in the community. "The scope of this conspiracy," he said. "Slowly, it's almost impossible to believe. They corrupted every institution that was supposed to protect people. And if what you said earlier is true, if this organization continued to operate through the generations, then the people who buried me alive last night are the direct inheritors of this tradition," Cordelia finished. "They know about this evidence, and they know it could destroy not just their current operations, but the entire mythology that their families have built around their ancestors' reputations." As they continued to examine Constance's evidence, both of them became aware of sounds in the distance, vehicles approaching the cemetery, moving slowly with their headlights turned off. Someone was coming, and they were trying not to be noticed. The people who had buried Cordelia alive had returned to check on their handiwork, and finding her gone, they were now searching for both her and the evidence she had been seeking. "We need to hide this," Josiah said urgently, beginning to repack the contents of Constance's box. "If they find us with this evidence, they'll kill us both without hesitation." But Cordelia was studying one final document from the box, a letter written in Constance's hand, but addressed to someone called the Keeper of the Sacred Trust. "Wait," she said. "There's more evidence. This letter mentions that she didn't put everything in this box. She distributed copies of the most important documents to multiple hiding places, including one that she entrusted to the guardian of the final resting place, the cemetery keeper," Josiah realized. She gave evidence to whoever was responsible for maintaining the cemetery, but that would have been— He paused, calculating dates and succession records. "That would have been my predecessor's predecessor, a man named Thaddeus Crane." The sound of car doors slamming shut echoed across the cemetery, followed by the low murmur of voices and the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Their pursuers had arrived, and they were spreading out to search the grounds systematically. Josiah and Cordelia had minutes at most before they would be discovered. "The maintenance records," Josiah whispered. "If Crane was given evidence by Constance, he might have left some indication of where he hid it. But we need to get to the shed without being seen." They carefully reburied Constance's box, marking the location so they could return for it later, and began to move stealthily through the cemetery toward the maintenance shed. The building was located near the back fence, partially hidden by a grove of pine trees that provided cover from the searching flashlight beams that were now sweeping across the grounds. The shed was exactly as Josiah had left it, but now it felt like a potential trap rather than a sanctuary. If their pursuers had done their research, they would know about the building and might already be watching it. But it contained the only records that might lead them to additional evidence, and without that evidence, everything they had discovered might not be enough to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Inside the shed, working by the faint light of a small flashlight, Josiah searched through the historical records for any mention of Thaddeus Crane's activities. The man had served as cemetery keeper from 1855 to 1891, spanning the entire period when the Willowbrook Society had been most active. If anyone would have been in a position to help Constance hide evidence, it would have been Crane. The breakthrough came in the form of a handwritten note tucked into the binding of the 1863 burial register. Written in faded ink, it was clearly Crane's handwriting. The angel weeps for the innocent, and her tears water the ground where truth lies buried. C.W. trusted me with sacred duty. 27 steps north of Sorrow's monument, 13 steps east of Hope's beginning, 7 feet down to where justice sleeps. It's another set of directions, Cordelia whispered. Crane hid something too, and he left instructions for finding it. But what's Sorrow's monument and Hope's beginning? Josiah thought about the cemetery's layout, trying to identify landmarks that would have existed in Crane's time and would fit his poetic descriptions. Sorrow's monument could be the large memorial that was erected for the Civil War dead. It was installed in 1865, but it commemorated deaths that occurred earlier. And Hope's beginning. That might refer to the children's section, where the angel statue stands. It was one of the first areas to be developed when the cemetery was expanded. The sound of footsteps on gravel was getting closer, and they could see flashlight beams moving methodically between the headstones. Their pursuers were conducting a thorough search, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the maintenance shed. Josiah and Cordelia needed to move quickly if they were going to find Crane's hiding place before they were discovered. They slipped out the back door of the shed and made their way toward the Civil War Memorial, using the larger monuments and mausoleums as cover. The memorial was a towering obelisk surrounded by smaller headstones marking the graves of local soldiers who had died in the conflict. From its base, they counted 27 steps north, which brought them to a section of the cemetery that contained some of the oldest graves. From that point, 13 steps east led them to the edge of the children's section, where the angel statue stood with outstretched wings and a face turned skyward in eternal grief. The statue had always been one of Josiah's favorite features of the cemetery, a beautifully carved piece that seemed to embody both sorrow for the lost innocents buried nearby and hope for their eternal peace. 7 feet down, Cordelia murmured. Crane buried whatever Constance gave him deeper than she buried her own cash. He wanted to make sure it would never be found by accident. As they began to dig at the specified location, both of them were acutely aware that they were completely exposed. The children's section was in an open area of the cemetery with little cover, and the flashlight beams of their pursuers were getting closer. They worked as quickly and quietly as possible, taking turns with the shovel and listening constantly for any indication that they had been spotted. 7 feet proved to be an ambitious depth for 2 people working with a single shovel, especially when they needed to remain silent. But after what felt like hours of careful digging, Josiah's shovel finally struck something solid. Unlike Constance's lead-lined box, what Crane had buried appeared to be a larger container, possibly a trunk or chest. The container was indeed a small wooden chest, reinforced with metal bands and sealed with wax like Constance's box. It was heavy enough that both of them were needed to lift it from the hole, and its size suggested that it contained significantly more material than what they had found at Minerva Ashford's grave. As they struggled to carry the chest to a more concealed location, the sound of approaching voices made their blood run cold. Their pursuers had reached the children's section and were methodically searching around the angel statue. In moments, they would discover the freshly dug hole and realize that their quarry had been there recently. "This way," Josiah whispered, leading Cordelia toward a large mausoleum that belonged to the Pembridge family. The structure was old enough that its door was secured with a simple lock that had corroded over the decades. With some effort, they were able to force it open and drag the chest inside, where they would be hidden from the searching flashlights. Inside the mausoleum, surrounded by the marble sarcophagi of the Pembridge family, they finally had a chance to examine what Thaddeus Crane had preserved for over a century. The chest contained everything that Constance had entrusted to him: plus additional evidence that he had gathered on his own during his years as cemetery keeper. The most significant discovery was a complete membership registry of the Brotherhood of Silent Commerce, showing not just the Willowbrook chapter but affiliated societies in dozens of towns across 3 states. The network was far more extensive than either of them had imagined, involving hundreds of prominent citizens who had participated in or protected the trafficking and murder of young women. But what made Crane's cache truly explosive was its inclusion of more recent documents, materials dating from the 1870s and 1880s that showed how the organization had adapted to changing times while continuing its criminal activities. The Brotherhood had evolved from a network of individual predators into something resembling a modern organized crime syndicate with formal leadership structures, territorial divisions, and business relationships with corrupt officials at the state and federal levels. "Look at this," Cordelia whispered, holding up a document that appeared to be a financial ledger. They kept records of every transaction, every payment, every favor traded. This shows exactly how they bought protection, from law enforcement and political figures. Some of these names, I recognize them from history books. These were senators, governors, federal judges. The implications were staggering. The Brotherhood of Silent Commerce hadn't been just a local conspiracy. It had been a criminal organization, with tentacles reaching into the highest levels of American government, protected by a network of corruption that spanned multiple states and decades. The young women who had died in places like Willowbrook had been victims of something far larger and more systematically evil than anyone had ever suspected. As they continued to examine Crane's evidence, both of them realized that they had uncovered something that went far beyond historical interest. If the Brotherhood had continued to operate and evolve over the generations, as Cordelia believed, then the documents they had found might be the key to exposing a criminal conspiracy that was still active in the present day. The people who had buried Cordelia alive weren't just protecting their ancestors' reputations. They were protecting an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been operating in plain sight for more than a century. The sound of voices outside the mausoleum reminded them that their immediate situation was still precarious. Their pursuers were getting closer, and the hiding place that had seemed secure was actually a potential trap. If they were discovered inside the mausoleum with the evidence, there would be no escape and no witnesses to their fate. But as they prepared to plan their next move, Cordelia made one final discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the bottom of Crane's chest was a letter addressed to the future keeper of these secrets, written in the cemetery keeper's careful handwriting and dated just days before his death in 1891. The letter contained information that neither Constance nor Morrison had possessed: the true identity of the Brotherhood's leadership and the location of their primary meeting place, where additional evidence might still be hidden after all these years.